So what we're doing is just sharing this across a couple of my platforms, so we can get a little bit going on, get a little bit of music going on in the background, just while we get it going. Okay, there we go. Alright, so hopefully y'all are enjoying the music. Alright, so that is basically it. So welcome to the very first live stream on our YouTube channel. I'm trying to switch it up a little bit just because Facebook doesn't really do what I need it to do. So we are switching platforms a little bit. I've talked about it back and forth. But anyway, this is it. So welcome to the channel. For everyone that's new, that if this is your very first time checking with the channel, this is kind of one of the things that we'll be having on here, and it's kind of our bedtime with Auntie series, but this one's actually more tailored towards the adults. So for those of you that don't really have time to read, don't really want to commit to like a subscription service like Audible or anything like that, you know, this is what we're doing. So this is what we're reading, just because it is one of the few adult books I feel like I have in my house. Right here, One Nation Under God's A New American History by Peter Manseau. And I could be messing up that last time, so I do apologize to the author. At a time, I had actually found this book at the Dollar Tree in one of my little rummages, and I actually enjoy going to the Dollar Tree for books. Not because I don't like paying full price, it's just you really do get some interesting finds there. And this is actually one of them, and it's more so a new take on the more or less whitewashed history that most of us grew up learning. You know, Christopher Columbus was this great man who saved the savages and all this stuff. And even though now as adults we know that it's not necessarily true, not necessarily, it wasn't at all true. This is just a really interesting thing because it feels like it takes all the kind of everything and just kind of brings it together in one cohesive look. So just here in the beginning, it has a little synopsis. So a grand if I can get my words out, you might run into this a few times with me. A groundbreaking new look at the story of America. American history often invokes an image of Puritans in the shining city on a hill, but the flip side of that image contains every other kind of person, of every color and belief. Peter Manseau's One Nation Under God's looks into the heart of the nation's broader history, using deep research to shed surprising light on a fascinating, often violent story. Spanning native religions and their attempted extermination, African traditions that survived the Atlantic transit, and homegrown heresies that bloomed on the frontier. These powerful stories from the outskirts of the American narrative form a rich and compelling new view of the people who forged a nation. One Nation Under God's shows how much more there is to the history we tell ourselves, right back to the country's earliest days. Thomas Jefferson himself collected books on all religions, and after learning that Congress might not take texts that reflected his eclectic interests for its brand new library, he threatened to pull his founding collection. He knew that Americans would need to understand every faith for any to have meaning. Looking at Americans and their many gods, Manseau fills in the country's story of itself, from a 19th century Muslim scholar jailed as a runaway slave to the women persecuted as witches in Salem, and who they really were. From oppressed Buddhists in California during World War II to spiritual experimentation in the 1960s, even to the most recent presidential election, where both candidates were from the first time non-traditional Christians. Dazzling in its scope and sweep, provocative in how it redefines the way the country can be understood. It is an American history unlike any you've read. So this is what we're going to read. Now, I don't know that we're going to read all the... We might get through the first chapter, actually. Yeah, we may or may not. Maybe not, though. First chapter's like 20 pages, and it's already 10 o'clock. So we might just get through the beginning, the introduction, for unearthing history. Introduction. Unearthing history. In the dry, red soil of Chimayo, New Mexico, there is a hole in the ground that some call holy. They intend no pun, no play on words. The hole is a serious matter. The locals who tend to it would no more joke about their humble opening in the earth than they would a hole in the head or the heart. An arm's length in diameter, and just deep enough that the temperature seems to drop when you lean in for a closer look, the hole has been there for centuries. The dirt in this valley has been regarded as sacred since before the birth of the republic of which it is now a part of. It has been revered as the physical nature of the spirit world since before the Spanish missionaries arrived with their own notions of embodied divinity. It was holy even before the first Europeans looked on the people of an unmapped continent and declared that they must know nothing of God. Though it has a long and eclectic spiritual history, the hole sits today in the back corner of a Roman Catholic church, El Santuario de Chimayo, which is among the most frequently visited religious pilgrimage sites in America. Hundreds of true believers and curious souls visit every year to line up in a small side chapel strewn with pictures of loved ones lost. They crowd into a closet-sized space around the hole, bend at the knees, dip their hands into the cool of the gap below, and pull up big handfuls of dirt. Some of it ends up in Ziploc bags, some in Tupperware tubs to be taken home on airplanes to every corner of the improbable nation. Much of it ends up in the mouths of the faithful. Visitors to Chimayo believe that eating the dirt brings miracles. As evidence, they point to the crutches hanging from the walls. Some would call this practice folk religion. Not the real or legitimate orthopraxy of a Christian church, but an indigenous corruption of the sanctioned sacrament of communion. Others might suggest it is in fact something more complicated, a distinctly American form of religious syncretism, a blending of faith traditions so complete that it is difficult to separate one from the other. Implicit in each of these explanations is a more obvious physical truth. The church at Chimayo was built over a hole in the ground that has history both connected to and independent of the structure around it. To extend the metaphor, in thinking about religion in American history, we have too often focused only on the church standing above the hole and not the hole itself, nor on the people lining up to make the soil within a part of their blood, their bones. The United States is a land shaped and informed by internal religious diversity, some of it obvious, some of it hidden. And yet the history we have all been taught has mostly failed to convey this. We have learned history from the middle rather than the margins, though it is the latter from which so much of our culture has been formed. We need only look to the point often seen as a beginning to know this is true. It is a story we memorized in school. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And he did so, we all have been taught, on orders at the expense of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs of Spain. Okay. This is all new, so it's telling me changing my key frequency. I don't know how to do that. Whatever, I'll figure it out. The largest of his ships was named for the mother of the Christian Savior. Its full name was Santa Maria de la Immaculada Concepcion, Holy Mary of the Immaculate Conception. In his journal, which begins in the form of a prayer, "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ," Columbus writes of standards bearing the cross brought unto the lands he was soon to conquer. Less well known are the men who sailed with Columbus, who did not call this symbol their own. No less than America would be, Europe at the time was a place endlessly conflicted over its multi-religious past. Having shaped so much of Iberian culture, practitioners of Judaism and Islam provided Spain's Catholics with a daily reminder that their world was not made by the Church alone. Whether this reminder was mere embarrassment or existential threat, it was reason enough to force them out. Columbus devotes the first words of his diary to praising Spain for evicting its religious minorities in the same year he had begun his voyage. And yet his own adventure could not have been accomplished without men drawn from the very peoples he was so pleased to see driven from their homes. It was precisely their connections to exiled faiths that led to several of his crewmen to join a mission that was less likely to end in riches than a watery grave. Even less well known are the spiritual practices of the Taino Indians, who paddled their boats out to greet the newly arrived ships. Columbus declared that the people he encountered could easily be converted to the faith of Christendom because they obviously had none of their own. In fact, they merely had no faith, he recognized, and so he was as blind to it as history books have often been. The dominance of the Christian narrative of Columbus over the more complicated quilt of beliefs present at the earliest encounter between the places called the Old World and the New illustrates a neglected aspect of the American history. At every turning point in the nation's narrative of encounter and expansion, an alternate spiritual history can be told. From a distance, it is easy to see only the Christian elements of much of American history. The church stands above, as unavoidable as any twice-told tale, obscuring the more beguiling story within. For another example, look no further than the well-known drama of the separatist Christians who left England to practice what they considered a purified version of the Protestant faith. Their establishment of a theocracy in New England, intended as a city upon a hill, usually serves as the Exodus story within the scripture of American history. England as Egypt, the ocean as desert, Massachusetts as the promised land. Mostly forgotten is that within a single generation, heterodoxy rather than the uniformity of spiritual purpose became the rule. Banishments from the heavenly cities established in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay began almost as soon as the passengers of the Mayflower and the Arabella came ashore. For, as though not forced into exile to brave the supposedly godless wilderness, colonists in both New England and Virginia made desperate attempts to maintain religious order by imposing harsh punishments on anyone who posed a threat to divinely harsh punishments on anyone who posed a threat to divinely ordained authority. Death sentences were threatened for the first offense of church robbing, as well as the third offense of blasphemy. Though history is quick to identify this entire era as Puritan, the more persuasive ideologies of the time may have been antipathy or indifference to the religious baggage that had come with muskets across the sea. The American experiment was frequently shaped by the rejection of old ways and openness to the new. In religious terms, this rejection created over time a nation unique in its ability to absorb and be built by those of different beliefs. People who believed there were many gods, or none at all. To be sure, the American talent for the absorption of faiths and cultures has rarely resulted in the kind of peaceful pluralism that most hope for today. The story of how a global array of beliefs came to occupy the same ocean-locked piece of land is more often one of violence than of toleration. There can be no clearer illustration of this than what occurred during the 3 centuries of slavery, which gave the nation its most enduring spiritual wounds. 20% of the U.S. population was enslaved at the Republic's inception, and few were Christian when they arrived. Most were born of religious histories as rich and complex as Christianism, followers of Islam, Yoruba, and a dozen other lesser-known faiths. During this era, there was a forced transplantation of African beliefs and practices into the growing body of American religion. Yet, the loss of such ancient traditions is often overlooked in the discussion of what was wrought by the painful period in our history. So too is the discussion of whether these traditions were truly lost at all. Much as the sacred Jews Christianized by the Spanish Inquisition came to influence Catholicism in the Old World, the newly converted men and women held in bondage dramatically changed the faith into which they were forced. Beliefs driven underground have a way of maintaining their power. They rise again in myriad guises, known to the faithful even when the faith is called by different names. The story of so many minority religious traditions living in the shadow of a single dominant creed may seem an epic only of repression and subjugation. However, it is in that tension between the marginal and the mainstream that the nation's so many faiths have come to call home has forged its commitment, clear on paper, if not always in practice, to become a place where, paradoxically, belief matters both very much and not at all, because we have the right to believe as we please. As Walt Whitman famously wrote, the United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. Though no corner of America is so tidy as a line of verse, no single life or community is so well ordered as any metered rhythm. No alliances are so secure that they can be thought as enduring rhyme. His meaning nonetheless rings true when surveying the vast landscape of faiths that together comprise the nation. In the century and a half since Whitman offered that reflection, the American poem has only grown in character and complexity. We might now think of the United States less as a poem than as a massive multi-generational novel. The plot of this novel, and so the plot of this book, is how the repeated collision of conflicting systems of belief, followed frequently by ugly and violent conflict, has somehow arrived again and again, not merely at peaceful coexistence, but at striking moments of inter-influence. These moments come along unexpectedly, often imperceptibly, to those involved. Some can be recognized only at a distance of centuries. Considering them now, we might view them as reminders that the process by which many peoples become one, e pluribus unum. It is not merely the gathering of populations or regions within one border. It is the many living among and learning from each other. It is every strident orthodoxy, it is every strident It is every strident orthodoxy making room for strange ways and exotic creeds. It is recognition that, to paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, those who believe in one God, those who believe in 20 gods, and those who believe in no God are bound together by something more significant than their own individual beliefs. And that is the end of our introduction. And so when we come back, which I believe will be on Thursday, not 100% on the time, we'll be starting Chapter 1, A Meeting of the Gods. And this will cover the time period of 1492 to 1512. And this actually, goes pretty far out. Let's see here. I really do like this book because I have a ton of acknowledgments and a ton of notes. Yeah, they go all the way up through, it looks like Barack Obama's time in office. Nice. So, okay, so hopefully everyone liked that. Like I said, this is more of the adult reading that we are doing. Which, like I said, we're going to do this on basically twice a week, maybe, that we're doing this. Just kind of a step up, just as something different. This is just a history book because I really love history. So hopefully you guys, I'm just hitting this really terribly. Hopefully you guys like this. Hopefully we can grow, keep on doing big things. Hopefully I get better at reading words because I stuttered over a lot of words. Words that you don't ever come across in everyday language. At least I don't in my daily things. But hopefully you guys have had fun. I know I did. And we're probably just going to go ahead and step off this stream. And I do hope that you guys kind of, have a good one and stuff like that. So, yeah, here we see.